So, what's the interpretation of the parable of the Good Samaritan? Listen. A certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho. Adam is meant. Jerusalem is the heavenly city of peace, from the blessedness of which Adam fell. Jericho means the moon and signifies our mortality, because it is born, waxes, wanes, and dies. Thieves are the devil and his angels, who stripped him, namely, of his immortality, and beat him by persuading him to sin, and left him half dead, because insofar as man can understand and know God, he lives. But insofar as he is wasted and oppressed by sin, he is dead. He is therefore called half dead. The priest and Levite who saw him and passed by signify the priesthood and ministry of the Old Testament, which could profit nothing for salvation. Samaritan in Hebrew could mean guardian, and therefore the Lord himself is signified by this name. The binding of the wounds is the restraint of sin. Oil is the comfort of a good hope. Wine, the exhortation to work with fervent spirit. The beast is the flesh in which Jesus chose to come to us. Being set upon the beast is belief in the incarnation of Christ. The inn is the church, where travelers are refreshed on their return from pilgrimage to their heavenly country. The next day is after the resurrection of the Lord. The two pieces of silver are either the two precepts of love, or the promise of this life and that which is to come, or possibly the two sacraments. The innkeeper is the Apostle Paul. The promise he makes to pay an extra expense incurred is either his counsel of celibacy, or the fact that he worked with his own hands, lest he be a burden to any of the brethren. And that is the interpretation of the parable of the Good Samaritan. Not, did you really think I was serious? But someone thought it was. And that someone who came up with that interpretation was Augustine, often known as Augustine, Saint Augustine, who lived over 1,600 years ago. He, this famous church father, this brilliant theologian, came up with this interpretation of the Good Samaritan parable. But Augustine was wrong. For all of his brilliance, he was wrong. Because each one of Jesus' parables has one main point, not a bunch of meanings, multitude of meanings. So what's the one main point of the Good Samaritan parable? Show kindness to your neighbor, which means anyone who is in need. There it is, plain and simple. Now, if you've been around church life long enough, you've probably heard this parable of the Good Samaritan in Sunday school class, in Bible study. You've heard sermons preached on it, and you're probably wondering, what can I say this morning different than what you've already heard? Or is it going to be the same old, same old? Yes, I'm supposed to love my neighbor, whoever that person is, by showing kindness whenever I can. Of course you're supposed to. That's obvious. But let me put a new twist on an old parable this morning. Maybe something you haven't thought about. In the original parable, not the one that Brooke read, where you have a hood, a squeak, and a cool square coming by, you have a priest, a Levite, and then, oh my goodness, a Samaritan. Jesus makes the hero of the story a Samaritan. And what's so amazing about that is that Jews and Samaritans did not get along, and that's an understatement. He even says that at the beginning of John 4. There was a hatred between the two groups for centuries. And so when Jesus' Jewish audience was listening to the parable and thinking, okay, the priest didn't do anything to help, the Levite didn't do anything to help, they're both Jewish, and here's a Jewish man who's been wounded and left on the side of the road half dead, and they're expecting the hero of the story to be somebody Jewish, like maybe the high priest of the temple, or maybe the synagogue leader. But no, Jesus turns a Samaritan into the hero. And I'm sure their eyes flew open wide and their mouths flew open, and they went, what? You've got to be kidding. It would sort of be like if you went over to Russia and retold this parable as the parable of the good Ukrainian, or in Ukraine, the parable of the good Russian, or go over to Gaza and retell the story as the parable of the good Israeli, or in Israel, the parable of the good Palestinian. See how far that will get you. Or even here in Canada, go to parts of Quebec and make it the parable of the good separatist. Or in other parts of Quebec, the parable of the good federalist. It would have the same effect as it did on those first hearers of the parable. The person you least expect. So here's the twist I'm going to give to this parable this morning. Maybe something you've not thought of. Who hates you? And if you're thinking, well, nobody hates me, at least not right now. I have no enemies. Okay, let me rephrase it. Who resents you? Still, nothing comes to mind? Okay, who dislikes you? Who ignores you? Now are names coming to mind? And if you say, I can't think of anybody, you can't be that popular. Come on. You can't. Even Jesus said in Luke's gospel, woe to you when everybody speaks well of you. So if you have no critics, you're not doing very well. Everybody has somebody who doesn't like them. Even Jesus, who was perfect, had people who hated him, resented him, disliked him, and just went out of their way to ignore him. If he had to put up with that, don't you think that we can be honest with ourselves and say, yes, I can think of people who dislike me? Sort of like the Jews and the Samaritans of the first century. That Samaritan who stopped by to help that wounded Jew on the road, he did not have to help him. He could have looked at him and said, ugh, a Jew, and kept walking. But he did something that nobody expected. Even though the two groups hated each other, he stopped to help, to show compassion, kindness, mercy, and love. So, who doesn't like you? Now, would you be a good Samaritan? Not will you be, or are you because you're probably sitting there going, yeah, I'm a pretty good person. I'm a good Samaritan. I help out when I can. I give money to the poor and the needy and help replenish the Cambridge Food Bank, and et cetera, et cetera. I don't go out of my way to hurt people. I try to help people. Yeah, I'm a good Samaritan. The question is, would you be a good Samaritan? Would you go out of your way to show kindness to that person who doesn't like you? Now is the parable hitting home? Would you do it? Or would you say, no, I'm going to let them make the first move? That's oftentimes the way we think. It's their move. If they show kindness to me, I'll show kindness to them. But I'm not going to go first. But isn't the point of this parable to act like a good Samaritan and go out of your way to show kindness to those who don't like you? Can you imagine the shock when that wounded Jewish man woke up after being wounded and left half dead and realized that his rescuer, his helper, was a Samaritan of all people? What? But I bet he would have never forgotten the lesson. Would you be a good Samaritan to the person who doesn't like you? Is it someone who is one of your relatives who doesn't like you? Is it someone who is a friend of yours or a former friend who doesn't like you? Is it a neighbor? Is it someone at work? Is it someone, yes, school's going to start soon, someone at school? Is it somebody you know and who knows you that you're just not on speaking terms and you know they don't like you? Would you be a good Samaritan? And would you treat them the way the Samaritan, the cool square in the parable, treated the person who was in need? Now, you may have to put on your thinking caps and your prayer shawls and say, Lord, what can I do specifically, not generally, to reach out to that person who doesn't like me, to show your love, instead of just doing the same old, which is nothing? You can either listen to the parable of the Good Samaritan and say, that's a nice story, isn't it? Or you can live it out by doing something, by becoming a good Samaritan to those who don't like you. Then the parable comes to life, because then it's lived out in your life, in my life. Will you reach out to those who treat you like dirt? I leave you with these words from a song written in the early 70s called Reach Out and Touch. Some of you may know it. Whether you're hearing it for the first time or whether you're hearing it yet again, will you not just hear it, but will you let it settle down in your heart and move you to action, to put your faith to work, to show the love of Jesus to those who despise you and reject you as he was? Listen to the words and then put them into practice. Reach out and touch a soul that is hungry. Reach out and touch a spirit in despair. Reach out and touch a life torn and dirty, a man who is lonely, if you care. Reach out and touch a friend who is weary. Reach out and touch a seeker unaware. Reach out and touch, though touching means losing a part of yourself, if you dare. Reach out and give your love to the loveless. Reach out and make a home for the homeless. Reach out and shed God's light in the darkness. Reach out and touch that stranger who meets you. Reach out and touch the brother who needs you. Reach out and touch that neighbor who hates you. Reach out and let the smile of God touch through you. Amen.